Hello there, my name is Kathleen Croney and I'm part of the Mostly Ghostly Tours team. And I would like to begin by thanking our friends at Nithraid for inviting us to take part in this year's River Festival, and we wish them every success with it. We've had a great time over the past few years working with the team and really excited to be involved once again. And our contribution will take the form of some storytelling. And I would like to share with you a story today concerning a most enigmatic local stronghold, one that is nestled between loch, woodland, and valley. And it sits in a very commanding position. Some of you may know it. It's Morton Castle, and it lies east of Thornhill. It is not the easiest place to find unless you really know where you're going, but part of it adds to that sense of mystery, sort of hidden and unknown. Now, there is a fantastic and very dark legend that relates to Morton Castle, and it goes back to the sort of medieval times when the man who was in charge, the Baron, he would have the power, really, of life and death in his domain. And the particular baron at the time who owned Morton had in his service a young man by the name of Edward. Now, Edward was a very kind soul. He was gentle, he was generous, he was well mannered, and he was very, very handsome. But one of his finest qualities was that of loyalty. He was devoted to the Baron, he would have done anything for him, and he was just an incredibly genuine soul. And in his heart, he held a great love for a local lass by the name of Agnes. And she was very like Edward in a lot of respects. She was described as one of the finest daughters of the Karen, and this is the area in which she lived. Now, the Karen water would progress, wending its way through Dorristeer, and it would spill into the Nith near Drumlanrig. And within this area of sort of enchanted woodland and beauty, Agnes and her family lived. Now, Edward had took it upon himself to admit his feelings to Agnes one day, and he met with her in the woods, and he spoke with her frankly and told her that he loved her. He wasn't quite sure how she would react. There was that sense of nervousness, but he was overjoyed when Agnes not only accepted his feelings, but admitted that she too shared that same passion. And the young couple could not wait for the time to come when they would be man and wife. Unbeknownst to Edward, however, there was another who held a love for him, someone that he would never have guessed. One day when he was at Morton Castle, the lady of Morton, the Baron's wife, spoke to him. She admitted that she'd been harbouring feelings of love for Edward for some time, and the young man was quite taken aback. Edward, being the sort of person he was, the last thing he wanted to do was to hurt the lady's feelings, but he explained his love for Agnes and absolute loyalty to her, and he hoped that she wouldn't be too hurt. However, the Lady of Morton was sickened by the awful wrench of rejection. She took herself away and she would sit and contemplate and think about what action she would take. And her feelings of rejection soon turned towards revenge. She wanted to get her own back on Edward for hurting her so deeply. And she began to hatch a plan in her mind. Her husband was away and he was due back any day. And when he returned to Morton Castle, the lady decided that she would twist the whole story around to suit her own selfish aims. She would tell her husband that it was Edward who had come on to her, not the other way around, and then he would have to suffer the consequences. And it was one of those quite wild nights when the Baron arrived back, complete with his horsemen. There was already a storm brewing, the sky was pretty dark, the sheep were all huddled together. The lookout at the castle alerted everyone to his arrival, and there was great celebration and feasting, with plates laden heavy with food in the banqueting area of the castle. Now, when his wife finally had a moment to herself with him, She approached her husband and she told the story of Edward and what he had said and allegedly done. The Baron sat and listened, and she could see within him that his temper was just ready to erupt. His heart was beating fast. He was absolutely furious. Just as the Lady of Morton told her story, an incredible crack of thunder reverberated around the valley. They could almost feel the ground shake. It was of pure violence. She took it as a portent of her own doom. Well, the Baron was very hasty in his actions and unmerciful. He demanded that Edward be taken by force to the very lowest, darkest dungeon of Morton Castle, and there he was to be starved to death. When the lady heard of this, she was immediately horrified, but felt unable to do anything to save him. So we can imagine the scene. A dramatic, dark and stormy night. The Baron shouting, cursing, filled with rage. His wife screaming. Young Edward pleading for his life to his master. The deed is done. Edward is locked within the dungeon. The Baron goes away once again, leaving the castle. His wife sits in her bed chamber, and the feelings of revenge that she once held have now transformed to remorse. She is guilt-laden. She feels absolutely horrendous, turns away food. She's got no appetite. There's no joy in her life. She now has to hatch another plan to try and free the stricken prisoner. One day, when she's coming back from a walk, she goes past the dungeon and she hears Edward inside. Pitiful groans, awful weak moans that she can hear. And she realises something has to be done. She confides in a trusted servant and speaks to the servant and says, "Can you please take some food to the prisoner?" The servant does as they are asked, so Edward is able to sustain himself. Her idea is that if she can keep Edward alive long enough, when the Baron returns, he's hopefully calmed down a little bit, she can reason with him. She's trying to work on some sort of plan here. And then she decides to go back into the woodlands and find Agnes, Edward's lover. Agnes is sitting in the woodlands one day, singing away to herself in her sweet voice and sewing. When she looks up, she hears a rustle in the trees. And when she looks a little bit closer, she gets a start. It is the Lady of Morton. Agnes can see that there is something wrong with the woman. She looks gaunt and pale. Agnes is about to inquire after her when the lady begins to tell the story, explaining that Edward has been locked up in the castle dungeon. Now, Agnes had no idea that this had happened. This hits her with great surprise and shock. She cannot understand why Edward would be imprisoned. Such a decent lad. There doesn't seem to be any reason for it. Of course, the Lady of Morton doesn't tell Agnes the full story. But she says, "When my husband returns to the castle, I would like you to come and plead for Edward's life. I think there's a good chance that he'll release him." And of course Agnes agrees. She wants nothing more than for Edward to be safe and his name to be cleared. A few days later, when the Baron returns from his expedition, he is surprised to learn that Edward is still alive. How, after all these days, has he not died? Instantly, a sense of suspicion is aroused within him. His wife finds an opportunity to introduce Agnes, but Agnes is given short shrift. She only spends a very short time in the presence of the Baron, and he is having none of it. There is not a chance that he is going to release Edward. He actually feels outraged by this episode, and Agnes flees from the castle, probably feeling lucky she's gotten away with her life. The Baron decides to put his foot down. This is going to end once and for all. He interrogates his servants to try and get to the bottom of it, to try and find out who has been giving him food. No one admits to anything. He hangs two of his servants just to make an example of them, which gives you a sense, perhaps, of the cruel fate that awaits Edward. He decides to source two wild, untamed horses, the idea being that Edward will be drawn by these horses to his death, a most ghastly and brutal end. And two such horses indeed are found in the local woodlands, and they are very, very wild. And he actually attaches a strap around the horses, and on the strap there are spurs. So wherever the horses move, they hurt. And it's, they go on, they ride faster and harder. And this is exactly what he is wanting. So the Baron decides that that's okay. This is going really well.